Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Jeff Keeter, and I have the great privilege and honor to be the president and CEO of your University of Iowa Alumni Association. We represent the 270,000 graduates of the university that live all around the world. We try to serve them to the best extent possible to make sure that their experience, their alumni experience, is meaningful where they live and in ways that are impactful on their lives, so that when the university calls on them, they're willing to say yes. This program that you have tonight is part of our Lifelong Learning Series, and it's a continuing program of the Alumni Association designed to bring educational programming to the alumni base. We pull on faculty and staff of the university primarily to come and talk to you, the alumni and the city and the friends of the university that reside here in Johnson County, about their areas of expertise and subjects that are important to the public discourse. And tonight's event certainly fits that model. We're pleased to have with us tonight Congressman James Leach. Jim now is a College of Law professor, having joined the faculty in 2013. He served most recently then as chairman of the National Endowment of Humanities. But of course, he's best known as being the representative in Congress from this area for more than 30 years. During that time, he chaired the Banking and Financial Services Committee, among others, and was the chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China. He's been a professor at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, the interim director of the Institute of Politics, and a lecturer at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He holds 14 honorary degrees and has earned decorations from foreign governments as well as many institutions and associations throughout the United States. We are pleased and privileged to have him here at the University of Iowa, and we're very grateful and thankful that he's with us tonight. I present to you Congressman Leach.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And first, I think we all should acknowledge that this has been an extraordinarily sobering year, accentuated by an extraordinary sobering event this past week. And as Americans, we all share the grief of our fellow citizens who were targeted for this truly preposterous mass shooting. Anyway, my hypothesis this evening is that history is to governance what experience is to a doctor or a lawyer, a carpenter or a chef. Unless we're dealing with exclusively names and dates, history itself is not orderly or precise. And if we think about depth of history, we have to probe the whys and wherefores as well as the consequences of events. And in this regard, when one looks at these things, history becomes a bit murky, and sometimes history is more consequent or more controversial than current events. Speaking about the concept of faith, St. Paul once said that we all look through a glass darkly. And what he meant was that one could have confidence in faith, but there is no one that's a mere mortal that can truly understand the will of God. And you might make an analogous observation about history itself. The lens of history is also dark, and it may depend upon the observation point, and the observation point may relate to the background of the individual viewer, and it may also relate to the time period in which one is making an observation. This lack of clarity, though, is a significant reason why political science is a misnomer. Politics is an art, it's not a science. And there's no such thing as certitude as there is in mathematics. And in terms of difficulty, I think the case for upgrading rather than downgrading the liberal arts has never been larger. Because if you think it through, as difficult it is for scientists to understand dark matter, it's far more difficult for a decision maker or the public at large to understand dark motives. In many eras, there have been a sage that has said something to the effect that if one doesn't look at history, one invites repetition of past mistakes. There's little doubt that this is a valid observation, but it doesn't mean that history is always well understood, and it doesn't mean that seemingly related challenges are helpful in dealing with current circumstances. And for example, as historians, and it's the most reviewed point in history, look at World War I. There was a great effort to try to figure out why we had a war based upon a relatively minor event, why tens of millions of people were killed because of the assassination of a minor archduke. And there was a general conclusion that the international system did not have enough flexibility. Then we come to World War II, and we think of the English Prime Minister who goes down in history as someone who appeased a bit during the 30s. And it appears that you can have too much flexibility as well as too little. And so you have two great wars that, in a way, relate to two different interpretations of historical judgment. I might mention in this regard that there's no ironclad set of laws that relate to history. And this is partly the case because to the degree that there's one constant in history, it's probably human nature. But human nature is varied, and it's varied at different times, and it's varied in different combinations. And I mention this because the closest thing to looking at human nature that has come down from the ancients is the idea of 7 deadly sins, which are, by the way, I had to look them up today: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth, contrasted with 7 virtues. And I'm confident nobody here knows all 7 virtues. Humility, chastity, charity, kindness, temperance, patience, and diligence. And the reason I mention this is that you can take these set of attributes or criticisms of people and make analogous sets. And in every single day, there's a little bit of a different mixture. And so you can take the same circumstance, and one day you have one way of thinking, another day you have a little different. And so how these interplay are of great significance, but they're also difficult to understand. Now, in a democracy, we all make judgments for various reasons. And one relates to political parties, one relates to whether candidates share issues, but always there's a circumstance that there's a judgment call too. For example, someone may be sharing a political party, maybe sharing a political attitude, but you might think they're a bit of a fox. I'm trying to come up with words that aren't too much like the word used in American politics today. But I also reference this because one of the things that doesn't get talked about, and I think is of enormous significance, is that our founders truly dwelled on the concept of human nature. And it was terribly meaningful because, as Madison explicated more than any of the others, there are very positive aspects of human nature, and there are also a few that are more worrisome. And that is the precise reason why we established a constitutional system with checks and balances. And every American understands checks and balances, the executive, legislative, judicial branch. There are 2 factors, though, that often get almost no thinking. And that is that this breakdown is not precise. There are overlaps between the Congress and the executive, between the executive and the courts, between the courts and the Congress. In fact, the recent, that is 5 years ago, 6 years ago, court ruling that I am the most appalled by, the one called Citizens United, is the Supreme Court of the United States making law, not interpreting law. It had the option of declaring a law of the Congress unconstitutional, which it did, but then it turned around and absolutely made up whole cloth a law, which was very different than the type of law that Congress had done. And I mention this because we have overlaps. And actually, there's no way of challenging the Supreme Court, although one can hope the court changes its mind or has a different composition. Now, I'm in trying to come up with something relevant for this evening, after coming up with a theoretical title about precedents and unprecedented aspects of American history, I want to first demarcate American history in 4 ways. One, the beginning of the Republic, which was all about whether a society could be formed based on the rights of man. The second great debate in American history was all about definitions. How do you define man? Is it someone that is simply pale, simply male, simply a property owner, or all three? And then we had a debate about, and largely symbolized in the last century, about the right of opportunity. In a way, contrasting Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the one hand with the philosophy and theories of Ronald Reagan on the other. And by the way, neither were near as radical as their reputations. Roosevelt, even in the second term, ran on the notion of a balanced budget. Ronald Reagan was actually quite a practical president in many ways. And in one of the circumstances that I lived through and did not, in this case, witness, but heard immediately about, that was truly moving. The President of the United States was shot one day at the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. He was closer to death than anyone knows. The first non-family member to visit him was Thomas B. Tip O'Neill. And Tip was a symbolic liberal in Washington. And Tip and Reagan were both Irish. They both liked each other a lot. Tip walked into Reagan's hospital and was stunned, apparently, by how weak the president looked. He got down on his knees, took Reagan's hand, and kissed it. Can anyone visualize a Republican today walking into the hospital room of Barack Obama? I mean, this is a really moving circumstance. And what's interesting to me, if you take the concepts that have evolved in a kind of discussive way, if someone is talking to you at a dinner table and mentions the word Congress, you instantly say something about dysfunctional. A word that everybody's known, but never applied the way it is being applied today. The founders never talked about dysfunctionality, they never talked about gridlock. And even if you come to the Reagan administration, which was fairly controversial, those words were never used. I mean, it was always understood that Reagan would have an approach, Tip O'Neill would try to modify it, Tip might lose, although he won some, but there would always be a result. You'd always have functionality. And this was an assumption. And I just stress this because that was what they were trying to establish, a government that would be limited, a government in which no one would have too much power, but a government that would work. And that was the effort in the Constitutional Convention. And the other aspect in addition to separation of powers, that was so central to the beginning of the Republic was that provision was made for the Constitution to change. Everybody knew that there was something different in judgment calls about the issue of slavery. But everybody at the Constitutional Convention also knew that there was no way you could form a country without accepting it in one way or another. And yet the Declaration of Independence was so profound in the concept that all men are created equal. Well, anyway, we come to the first inaugural, which I consider to be the most relevant speech for America today. And it's intriguing that probably only one paragraph was written by the speaker. And the speaker, of course, was George Washington. But he called over to Mount Vernon his friend, James Madison. And he said to Madison that an aide of his had written a speech, and would he review it? And Madison said, of course. And he went in the other room, and after a while he returned to Washington. Washington said, what do you think? And Madison said, this is terrible. And Washington said, why? He said, well, first of all, it's an hour, maybe more. No one can endure that. Secondly, it's very regal. And the kind of society we're building is of a very different order. And so George Washington said, well, would you like to write me a first inaugural? And he said, sure. And he came back a couple days later. And it's a totally Madisonian script, except the first paragraph, which only Washington could have written. Because it begins, and Washington is talking to the Congress assembled in New York City at something called Federal Hall. And he's seeking their support and their assistance. And so he begins by saying, you must understand that I have no civil administrative experience, and I was not born with many abilities. In other words, he said, I'm inexperienced and I'm dumb. And he said it more deftly than that. But the point is, I don't think any president or any governor has ever begun a speech that way. And yet, if one thinks about it, it is the circumstance of all presidents at this time. And by this I mean, if you imagine for yourself the ablest person you can conceive of, who has views closely to your own, and they get elected president of the United States, that person will only know a little bit about a few things that will be dealt with in government. Government is now absolutely gigantic. And our society is absolutely gigantic, and because government touches many aspects of society, you absolutely, desperately need truly good people to have work with you. And you have to be able to delegate authority and recognize when you have to be totally responsible and when you have to delegate to your cabinet members, to your ambassadors, whoever it may be. And so one of the reasons that one should vote for or against any presidential candidate is frankly who you think they're going to have around them. And if you think they're going to be good, and if you think the person can cope. And those are really big kinds of decisions. Anyway, in this first inaugural, Washington deals with something that people haven't thought about for ages. And that is, how should elected people vote? What should guide them? And he established 3 no's. And he says there should be no local prejudices, meaning that one should vote for the national interest over the local. Secondly, that there should be no separate views, and by that he meant that people should not be conniving to form another country. And thirdly, he said there should be no party animosities. Well, those are big no's. And then he said, how do you decide? And he said you should follow, and I'll quote this, the pure and immutable principles of private morality. And that sounds kind of otherworldly and kind of not only abstract, but obtuse. But what he really is saying is, you should follow a clarion call of independent judgment. And then you ask yourself, how does Congress operate today? And I will try to explain this because it's something that involves chemistry. And Congress today, and it didn't happen overnight. There is this philosophical precept that sometimes there are changes in degree that at some point become a difference in kind. And that's what's occurred. Congress changed gradually over the last 40 years or so in ways of making decisions. Until today, going from 3 or 4 party caucuses a year, which that party caucus meaning the Republicans meet in some room together, the Democrats meet in some room together. Now we have 1 or 2 caucuses a week. And caucuses have become, instead of a caucus being brought together to talk about schedule and the coming election or whatever, they're about what we're going to do to defeat the other party. And they're analogous, as close as I can suggest, to a football team at halftime, in which you're trying to figure out every strategy you can to defeat the other side. What I think Congress has lost track of is who the team is. And so if you think of anybody in public life, you take an oath of office. The oath is to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, which is a very unusual oath because if you take a British oath, it's to support the Queen and her successors, which is a very different theory than supporting the Constitution. What does supporting the Constitution, protecting it mean? It means you work within the system, you're guided by the processes of government that are established. And these processes that the government, the founders visualized, that you'd have people elected from all sorts of different states with all sorts of different backgrounds, and you have to build their judgments together. And in the Declaration, we talk about all men being created equal. Well, if all men are created equal, and I'll get into the definitions of man a bit further, but if all men are created equal, it follows that everybody's judgment should be treated with respect. But they're not. And so what we have is kind of a food fight in Congress, and that's why we have words like dysfunctionality and that just don't fit the times. Anyway, Washington made 2 other observations. The one's not an observation. One is he referred to a greater authority, and he referred to it 4 or 5 times in this, like the great father of humankind. But he never references the word Jesus Christ or the word God, because Madison wrote this. And even though the majority of the country was Christian, they were making way for the Bill of Rights that had yet to be crafted. In fact, that was the principal duty of the first Congress, was a Bill of Rights in which we very progressively, among other things, called for freedom of religion. But anyway, Washington concluded his address with, "The success of government depends upon," and I quote these 2 words, "temperate consultations between those who are holding of the public trust." And that literally means between members. It also means between branches of government. And so one can make their own judgment of whether we're living up to the model that Washington set. Now, Washington also had a farewell address. And intriguingly, he intended to serve 1 term, and so near the end of his first term, he called Madison back and said, "How about a farewell address?" And Madison said, "Sure," and he wrote one. And then the feelings between Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson became Morris Stark in Washington felt that to keep the country together, he better run for a second term, which he did. And towards the end of the second term, he called Hamilton in and said, "Would you review Madison's draft?" And Hamilton did, changed some, added some, but didn't throw out most. And in the second inaugural, the farewell address, which was never delivered, he really took Madison's advice, and what he did was he published it in the spring of 1797 as a letter to the people of the United States of America. And he basically had three quick themes. One, it was a call for national unity, because even then it wasn't clear it could be held together. He called for national expansion, and we forget that there was debate at the time on whether there should be another country to the west, and whether it be to the southwest or northwest. And then he warned against foreign entanglements, a subject that I wish 4 or 5 of our presidents had paid more attention to, such as John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon on the Vietnam War, and George W. Bush on the Iraq War, in which we engaged in countries that did not attack us. On the religious front, Jefferson is the most interesting of the founders. He was considered a deist, and he took the subject of religion unbelievably seriously. And he we certainly are only political comparative religionists, and maybe one of the few in the country that studied comparative religion. And he made a really, truly interesting conclusion, and that is that he said what mattered most between the great religions of the world was not where there were differences, but where there were commonalities. And then he listed them. He also changed his own Bible, and basically he took the passages he liked and took out the ones he didn't. Which, I don't know what that means if one were thinking about the 10 Commandments, who would take what out? Too many jokes on that subject. Anyway, Jefferson is also the one who, in this famous letter in 1802 to the Baptist Assembly in Connecticut, he used the phrase separation of church and state, which has come down in a very meaningful way to all of us. Now, as a person, his morality was perhaps imperfect. If you read about the Hemings woman, as a founder, he's pretty impressive. As a president, he's responsible for an abuse of constitutional authority, which all of us celebrate. And that is, he clearly bought Louisiana without first getting a law passed in Congress. And that was a pretty good purchase. In fact, we're part of that purchase. And as a candidate, he's top Trump in some of his language that he's responsible for. Donald Trump is called Jeb Bush low energy. That's not the worst thing that can be said about someone. Jefferson hired a journalist to call John Adams a hermaphrodite. I had to look that up. I'm sorry. Anyway, Adams was not too pleased and refused to talk or communicate with him for a decade, slightly more than a decade, and then a well-known physician who was named Benjamin Rush, who was the physician to all of the founders in Philadelphia, wrote the two of them and got them together, and then they agreed to do a set of letters back and forth that are now part of American history. And then, as you know, they both died on the same day, on July 4th in the 1820s. Anyway, back to the subject of the second great debate, which was about definitions. In some ways, Lincoln is the star, but he also was a follower. And the greatest precipitator of the abolitionist movement was a woman, and this is Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel that was read by more Americans than any other book up to that time. And there have been very few novels in world history that have been published. And it captured the imagination of the country and the soul of particularly the New Englanders. It is possibly apocryphal and possibly not that Abraham Lincoln had this famous meeting with Harriet Beecher Stowe. I don't know if you know this, that Stowe visited the White House in 1862. And as he came in, Lincoln shook her hand and said, "And so, you are the little lady that started this big war." And that's a really profound thought, but not totally without some justification. In any regard, by the 1850s, change had started in American politics in the North. And that is, the Conservative Party, the Whigs, did one of the fastest disappearing acts in the history of politics. And in short order, that is less than 5 years, the Whigs got bifurcated into two political parties. And one was called the American Party, which otherwise held the title the Know-Nothings. And the Know-Nothings were a party which were as close to a single issue ticket as there could be until this year. That is, they were totally and utterly anti-immigrant, and they were particularly virulent in their anti-Catholicism. And they argued that one couldn't be a Catholic and have dual loyalty to the papacy and to the country. And this is obviously preposterous, but it didn't seem that way then. And then in the West, and beginning in three small towns, one of which is 15 miles south of here called Crawfordsville, in a church in Crawfordsville and a small building in Ripon, Wisconsin, and a slightly larger building in Jackson, Michigan, groups of people came together who formed the Republican Party of the United States. And by 1856, and this is less than 3 years later, the Republicans had a thoroughly credible, although murderous, presidential candidate, and his name was John C. Fremont. And Fremont was an adventurer who killed a lot of Indians. He became the military governor of a foreign state, that being the Bear Flag Republic, and one of California's first two senators, as the Bear Flag Republic took down its flag. And he married well. He married Thomas Hart Benton's only daughter, I think only daughter. And Thomas Hart Benton was the first five-term United States senator from Missouri, whose grandson or great-grandson was a painter and printmaker, largely regionalist, but also more than that. Anyway, Thomas Hart Benton carried 37% of the Electoral College. And the support came from small towns and from the West, of which we were part of the West. Because one of the reasons the Whigs had collapsed was that everybody that had come west had come here with nothing. They had to borrow, and the borrowing had ties to the Eastern banks, and Eastern banks were quite unpopular. And so the Whigs splintered into the American Party and into the Republican Party, and that elected a Democratic president, which laid the groundwork for the next election in 1860 for Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln, by the way, named John C. Fremont the military commander of the West until he fired John C. Fremont for disobedience. And one of his most severe acts of disobedience was that John C. Fremont issued the first Emancipation Proclamation. And it was Lincoln's view, and the view of virtually everyone in Washington, that that would cause at least one and probably two and maybe three more states to join the Confederacy. And so he wanted to hold the Union together. In Iowa, we had a fabulous German language paper in Davenport called Der Demokrat. And it had been a strong booster of Lincoln and was a strongly Republican paper. And I use the word Republican with care. In the 19th century, Republicans were the Progressive Party. And Democrats were pro-slavery in general. But anyway, the only time it varied with Lincoln was it objected strenuously that he was too slow to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But as it worked out, he issued it at a particular moment in time that was quite helpful to the Republic, because more states hadn't left the Union, and because it was a major factor in blocking the possibility in Britain and maybe France of supporting the Confederacy rather than the Union. And there were a lot of people in Europe that were still had their eyes on the Americas and looked at the idea of a splintered land as being more hopeful for their interests than a single republic. So anyway, the Emancipation Proclamation was about principle. It was also about the politics of paying attention to where others stood. I just want to mention one other aspect of the Know-Nothings, because part of its strenuousness and being more anti-Catholic than Trump's supporters are anti-Islamic was because so many people were competing for jobs with the new immigrants from Ireland and Italy. And this was a very concerning phenomenon, and it involved more than the working classes. One of the real polymaths of the early 19th century was Samuel F.B. Morse, who invented the telegraph and the Morse code. He also was the premier portrait painter of the era and the founder of something called the National Academy of Design, which was the citadel at the time of the arts. But he ran for mayor of New York on a know-nothing type ticket, and he argued that all Catholic immigration should be blocked, and that all Catholics in this country should not be allowed to hold public office. Now, the reason I mention that is that some of these movements are not just movements of one class of people, that they're often movements that go much beyond it. The 1850s also found the great incident that many members of the House of Representatives in the 20th century used to celebrate, and that is when a congressman named Preston Brooks walked over to the Senate floor and caned almost to death the United States Senator, whose name was Charles Sumner. And it was all about Sumner having referenced a senator from South Carolina who happened to be the uncle of Brooks. And Sumner had called him, Sumner, yes, had called him a pimp for slavery, which is also a term that was not well received. And so for literally a century, Southerners had considered this catering to be an act of chivalry, Northerners of assault and battery, and realistically, more likely, simply evidence that there was going to be no way to resolve the slavery issue without war. Especially when the Supreme Court of the United States made it very clear in the worst ruling in its history, what is called the Dred Scott ruling. It suggested that individuals with dark-hued skin could be bought and sold as property. Now, it's my personal view, and some people think it's a little too glib, but I don't, that there's inverted logic in the second worst ruling in the court's history, that being Citizens United. In Citizens United, inverting Dred Scott, it holds a class of property, that is, corporations have the rights of human beings, and therefore are protected by the First Amendment to buy and sell candidates. Anyway, Lincoln was fond of, if you remember the movie Lincoln, he said, and you really had to wonder exactly what he meant for a minute. He said, you know, Euclid used to argue that things equal to the same thing are equal to each other. And so you had to stop for a minute and say, what's he referring to? And in math, if you ever remember this from 8th grade, it's if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. Well, what he was saying was, if a dark-hued person is a man and a light-complected person is a man, both being men are equal to each other. And that makes great sense. Now, a corollary to me of this is that if A is not equal to B, then B is not equal to A. And what I mean by this is, if in Citizens United, a corporation is not a person, then a person can't be a corporation. And the second great assumption of Citizens United is that money is speech. But if you go to a dictionary, money is a medium of exchange, and it can be used to facilitate speech. It can also be used to facilitate buying a book, a car, or political influence. But if money isn't speech, speech can't be money. And therefore, Citizens United is a logical sophistry. Now, that's my own view. Not everyone agrees with it. But it's also, Citizens United is about who is a man. The 13th Amendment to our Constitution establishes African Americans as men with citizenship rights. The 19th Amendment establishes women as men with citizenship rights. And the question is whether a corporation is a man, which I deny, and then whether money is speech, and whether the color green is a voice of man. Anyway, all of this is kind of confusing. America was defined best in the poetry of Lincoln. And Lincoln did not say on the greatest battlefield of the Civil War that people have given the last full measure of their devotion to support a government up by and for corporations. And no corporations were killed at Gettysburg. Anyway, the struggle for many rights continued into the 20th century, and we had the great civil rights movements. And we also have them continued somewhat with skirmishes today on the question of voting tactics and whether there are suppression types of things that states can do, which I think is about as unseemly as a democracy can be. who as a citizen got a little bit complicated in the 20th century, and when the great liberal president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by executive decree, not by legislation, sent Japanese Americans into camps. And in 1939, the government of the United States of America turned back a merchant ship, the MS St. Louis, with 908 Jewish refugees from Germany, and didn't allow them to land in America. And I raised this issue, or these issues, that everybody vaguely kind of remembers and knows, but they should be front and center on the concerns being expressed today about immigration and what a great society can do and what it cannot do or should not do. And the third debate is about opportunity. One of its first emanations, and I think is, and I hesitate to be critical of the Supreme Court because it is truly one of the great civilizing and balancing institutions in any government in the history of any society. But in 1890, the United States Congress passed something called the Sherman Antitrust Law. And everybody vaguely knows what that means, that you have to be cautious about monopolizing commercial power. Well, in 1893, the Supreme Court of the United States held that the Sherman Act did not apply to a manufacturing corporation, but it did apply to unions. I can't think of a less reasonable ruling. In fact, when the Clayton Act was adopted 2 decades later, it reversed that aspect of the court's decision. Why I raise this is that you have the issue of opportunity, but you also have one similarity to today to the 1890s, and that is we are statistically in a second Gilded Age. And Gilded Age means where the well-to-do have a disproportionate amount of wealth compared to everybody else. And the numbers now are chilling. And so we also have had lots of periods in which everybody has risen together, but we're now in one of the 2 periods in which that is not the case. And all of us as citizens should be concerned. Now, on the plus side of the opportunity debate under Franklin Roosevelt, we had the WPA, we had the Federal Deposit Insurance that were passed. We had an Iowan, by the way, who played one of the largest roles of anyone in the history of public administration. And this is Harry Hopkins, who was the de facto chief of staff to Franklin Roosevelt and lived for 3.5 years in the White House in the Lincoln bedroom. And Hopkins was the architect of the WPA, which hired 7 million people in a 7-year period, and also ran 2 other WPA programs, or 2 other jobs programs. But what very few people knew at the time, other than at the State Department, is that Harry Hopkins was the principal foreign policy advisor to the President of the United States. And he was FDR's liaison to Great Britain and Churchill. He was FDR's liaison with the Russians. He was FDR's liaison with the Pentagon. And he was the great booster of what we call Lend-Lease. In the 30s, we did have very strong feelings between Republicans and isolationists and the president. And Hopkins, who had been a social worker in New York and a graduate of Grinnell College, was also very, very big on the military buildup. And in historical terms, there are very few people that have a record that has been more vindicated by history than Harry Hopkins. But let me move on and mention some things in the 40s that I think are truly remarkable. And one involves the senator named Vandenberg from Michigan, who in the 30s had been one of the two most sticklish senators against everything but everything that Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted. But in 1946, he was considering running for president of the United States. And he was visited by two journalists that were preeminent at the time, one towards the end of his long career and one towards the beginning. And the two together were Walter Lippmann and James Scotty Rustin. And they came to talk to him about his possibility of running for president, and then possibly discussed in advance, I had no idea. They entered a discussion saying, you know, you've got this record of being an isolationist, and the war kind of has vindicated Roosevelt. Have you thought of kind of changing directions and supporting the new president, Harry Truman? And he said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, there's this new Truman doctrine, there's this issue of coming up of aiding Western Europe, which became the Marshall Plan, and NATO. And he said, why should I do that? And they explained, and Vandenberg apparently said, well, would you like to write me a speech? And they said, sure. And they came back a few days later, these two great newspaper men with a speech for a senator of the United States. And he gave this speech on the Senate floor, which came to symbolize that you stand with the president at the water's edge. Well, one of them in the New York Times and one of them in the Washington Post wrote editorials saying, in effect, this is one of the greatest speeches in the history of the United States. And it certainly was the greatest speech in the 20th century given in the United States Senate. And it made quite a hero of Vandenberg, but it came to symbolize bipartisanship. And we had this era of bipartisanship. And certainly Eisenhower saw some of it. The worst example of some partisanship under Ike was you had a 1957 civil rights bill that Lyndon Baines Johnson, as the leader of the Senate, eviscerated and passed in a very, very mild way. But LBJ, and 8 years later, as President of the United States, passed the Eisenhower Civil Rights Act. Why not? But as a general rule, Ike held good relations with the Congress, and it was quite an era to grow up in America. I would just like to mention in all this, because to me it's really intriguing. We've come to call a generation the greatest generation, and we do it almost glibly now. I think it is one of the most apt descriptions ever given, because that generation not only won the greatest war in history, it then proceeded at enormous expense to win the peace. And we've never thought a lot about this distinction between war and the peace until the last few years, when we've been engaged in wars that haven't gone so well, and peace that hasn't gone well at all. And so there's more and more attention to what happens in the wake of war, and more and more attention to considerations of that before engaging in war. But that generation got it perfectly, and people forget that tax rates under Dwight David Eisenhower were almost double those under Barack Hussein Obama. And no one ever called Ike a socialist. Now we have a problem that, frankly, the supporters of Trump and the supporters of Bernie Sanders have it right. That is that the establishment has disappointed. And this is a very awkward thing. In fact, in the war in Iraq, the cost is approaching $4 trillion. And then we have the loss of life, and then we have the loss of life of others, not just our own. And we've precipitated some things in the Middle East that I think are quite regrettable. And then we're facing an aspect of this that relates to the word religion that we were warned about, first of all, here in Iowa. And what I'm getting at is, people may recall that in 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri. It is considered one of the greatest speeches ever given in this country because he coined the term Iron Curtain. Well, I guess 17 years later, in Grinnell, Iowa, another Britisher named Arnold Toynbee gave a speech that he intended to be more important than the Churchillian speech. And what he said in this speech was he wanted to talk about what is likely to precipitate war in the foreseeable future. And he said that Russians had it all wrong, that dialectical materialism, class struggle, was historically nonsense. And then he said Americans have to understand that they're involved in a very important civil rights struggle, but there's no great evidence that race relations are going to be causes of war itself, of a significant dimension. And then he said, what is likely to cause war in the foreseeable future are religious differentiations. And that seemed totally and utterly out of sync with anything anyone in America was thinking. I mean, it seemed ridiculous, partly ridiculous because in large measure, we had advanced as a society into less religious, intense kind of feelings against other religions, although that's always a little bit a part of religion. But we were in the Cold War, and that idea just didn't seem to fit anything. But if one were to say, based on the last decade, was Arnold Toynbee a little bit prescient, one would have to say just maybe. And I will tell you, as someone that lived through this in the United States Congress, we'd engaged in war in the Gulf, what we call the first Gulf War, under George H.W. Bush, in which we had 50 allies, and it was about pushing back a country that had invaded another country. And so we'd been engaged in the Gulf, but a decade later, when 9/11 hit, and when the buildup started to rise for possible intervention again, there was hardly a congressman that had ever heard of Sunni and Shia. And I mention this because we entered this war unknowing. And we also entered the war with mischievous information being given by the executive branch, relating to something called Yellow Cake, relating to allegations that Iraq was part of 9/11, and there's no evidence whatsoever that that's the case. And so we entered a war under false premises, and a war that has not worked. But I reference this only because if people had read the speech of Arnold Toynbee and given it any weight, that would have been a real serious consideration. And so we have to learn from others as well as from what we've done. Now, in terms of the unprecedented, I would like to stress that there are two extraordinary things that we're going to be living with for the rest of our lives that are not happy ones. And one is that we're one of the first generations, and now it's much more serious, that are living with weapons that can destroy virtually all of life on the planet. And that's the nature of nuclear weapons. There are also other weapons of mass destruction, of which the worst is perhaps biological, well, certainly biological. We're also looking at novel ways in which weapons can be delivered. You can deliver awful weapons by airplanes, you can deliver by missiles. You can deliver them by sailboats. You can deliver them through the mail. There's now a subject that the Russians have just suggested that a small submarine with a nuclear weapon can be brought up to a coastal city and cause a nuclear tsunami. And I raise this just because the greatest political science observation that I know of in modern times comes from a scientist. And that is Einstein once suggested that splitting the atom had changed everything except our way of thinking. And that's a pretty awesome thought in a world in which literally history is laden with war. There's hardly a period in time in which someone somewhere isn't at war. And now we're seeing these weapons of mass destruction proliferate and bizarre ideas suggested on how they might or might not be used. President Eisenhower warned years ago of a military-industrial complex. Today, my worry is about the role of what I call a political-ideological complex, where ideologues use politicians as pawns, and politicians use ideologues, especially those with deep pockets, as enablers of personal ambition. And this reinforcing set of mutual interest has little to do with the common good and much to do with the breakdown in civility in public life. Civility, to some, is kind of a bandy concept, but it's not simply or principally about manners. It doesn't mean that a spirited debate is to be ignored or avoided. Indeed, the case can be maintained that few things are more important than argumentation in a democracy. Without argumentation, there's a tendency to dogmatism and possibly even tyranny. And so what civility does require is simply a willingness to listen to other people, a willingness to take their concerns into consideration, with an understanding that we all rely on each other. Uncivil speech, which we've heard a lot about, is really dispiriting for society. Nevertheless, in many ways, more mischievous in governance is very civil speech. And let me explain what I mean. On Capitol Hill, every day, members of Congress walk to and from the House floor, the Senate, vice versa. And there are very civil people, well-dressed, friends who are lobbyists. And the typical conversation goes something like this. Hi, Joe. Tomorrow we have this vote coming up. Gosh, we were sure happy to max out for you in the last campaign. We want to more than max out in this one with more allies. But we really need your support tomorrow. And by the way, how are the wife and kids? And that's very, very civil. And yet implicitly, it suggests a contract between a lobbyist and an elected official, and that there's a quid pro quo that's expected. And so I am not particularly worried about some of the bad words in politics, but I am very worried about the obligations that are being undertaken. In America, fortunately, because of our system, there is very, very little corruption in American politics. But there is a huge growth in conflicts of interest. And the conflicts of interest have been made by the Supreme Court of the United States legal. And so there's no corruption from a legal point of view, but the system itself is no longer as idealistic and no longer as uplifting as it should be. Well, let me just end with another concept about the law, and that is we also live in a world in which international law matters. And if when we're looking at the 20th century, I think most Americans might come to the conclusion, maybe we made a mistake not joining the League of Nations. By the way, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the vice presidential candidate in 1920, and he gave over 200 speeches in which he argued for the League of Nations. But he didn't argue the way Woodrow Wilson argued. He said the reason we should join the League is if we don't, those darn Europeans will control international relations. And so it's kind of an anti-Europe argument, which I thought was kind of charming. And by the way, do any of you know how the United Nations got its name? I will tell you, it's a great story. In 1943, Winston Churchill was visiting the White House and staying in the Lincoln bedroom, kicking Harry Hopkins out of his bed. And they talked about forming another global organization at the end of the war, and they talked about you couldn't call it the League of Nations again. You needed a name. They couldn't come up with a name, and then Churchill retired to the Lincoln bedroom. And then all of a sudden, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in his wheelchair, wheeled into the Lincoln bedroom as Churchill was emerging from the bath, sans loincloth. At which point, quick as he is, he said, well, you know, the Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States. At which point, it is understood that Franklin Delano Roosevelt stammered, United Nations. And that is how the name came to be approved. I think it's a great story, and true, not apocryphal. Anyway, of other things that the United States Senate, I think, has been derelict on. I have to be careful because I never served in the Senate. But it has to date not ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban. It has not ratified the Law of the Seas. Tragically, the test ban is less important than it would have been if it had been ratified in the 1960s. It were actually been negotiated in the 1960s. Instead, we negotiated something called a limited test ban that ended up being an environmental agreement more than an arms control agreement. But if we had then, we might have a different number of nuclear powers. On the Law of the Seas, we now have problems in coastal regions off China and potentially in the Arctic. The other countries with interest have ratified. And we are in a very weak position from its beginning of its being negotiated, which was done in the late 70s, early 80s, with our negotiator being one of the greatest Republicans to ever serve in modern times, Elliot Richardson. We refused to ratify, even though the Department of Defense, led by the Department of the Navy, has been its staunchest supporter from the beginning, because it says what straits the world our ships can go through, and defines them as international waters. The Arctic is loaded with natural resources. It's also going to be a major waterway. And there are clearly going to be serious legal battles underway. And the United States is going to be behind the eight ball because it has not ratified the Law of the Sea, which is in the direct national interest of every American citizen. And it all relates to politics. And a fact that the Law of the Sea was negotiated by the United Nations, which for some means that it can't possibly be right, and that to some it means that a international treaty gives up American sovereignty, even though our founders wrote treaty ratification language into the Constitution because as a general framework then and now, you have treaties to advance mutual interest. And this one could not more. Let me just end by saying that many Americans have figured out that we have this tragic juxtaposition, that this country leads the world in business, in the arts, in the professions, every field of academia. But somehow the political system is letting us down. And so one of the great challenges of our time is to bring the political system up to the standards of the rest of our society and to make America respected again in the world. Thank you very much. I'm told that there is time for some questions if anyone would like to ask. I am a little bit blinded by the lights, so I'm going to have to ask this young man to, okay, go ahead.
Hi, John. Thank you. That was beautiful. Would you just care to comment a little bit on the libertarian Gary Johnson and the phenomenon that he has, in recent weeks, been polling about 10% or better in a three-way race? Thank you.
Well, first to your question, I don't know, I've never met Gary, and so I can't comment on him. I have met his running mate, Bill Weld. And so you have two governors running on the Libertarian ticket. Bill Weld was considered a moderate Republican governor of Massachusetts. He was married to a woman who was the granddaughter of Teddy Roosevelt, which I always thought was kind of cute. But he no longer is, so there's no Roosevelt type at the moment. None of us know what kind of impact a third party is going to make in this race. I thought at one point that Mayor Bloomberg was going to run, and I know him relatively well, and I would have been sympathetic to his candidacy. When he decided not to run, he made an interesting case that was both very confident and also somewhat troubling. He pointed out that if he ran, he was confident he would win several states. But he did not see a prospect of winning the majority of the Electoral College. But the way our system works is that people kind of know that it's an Electoral College decision-making process. But what happens if no candidate gets a majority of the Electoral College? And the Constitution is quite clear, and it's not necessarily totally rational, but this is its clarity. The presidency of the United States will be chosen by the House of Representatives. The House can only vote between three candidates, the top three candidates in the Electoral College. It was the judgment of Mayor Bloomberg, and I'm confident he did a lot of surveying to reach this judgment, that would mean in his judgment that he could not possibly prevail, and that the Democratic candidate probably could not either. Because when the vote goes to the House of Representatives, it is not a vote of each individual member adding up to 435. It's a vote by state. And Republicans control the large number of small states. And so he believed that at the time he decided to back out, that would elect either Mr. Trump or Mr. Cruz. And he believed both would be against the national interest. And so he decided not to run. Now, in terms of the Libertarian ticket, I don't know if it'd be any different or not. It'd be conceivable it might have a slightly higher chance in the Electoral College than Bloomberg, but I don't know how much higher. And maybe less. I just don't know. It's hard to know. Now, there have been for years a major League of Women Voters issue has been to go to direct election for presidents to avoid all of this. There was a Stanford University engineer who 15 years or so ago figured out a non-constitutional amendment way of having direct election of the presidents. Have any of you heard about this? And the way, it's kind of an intriguing way to do it. It's also a bit mischievous. But right now, every state has a different rule, but in general, the electors that the state sends to Washington after the election must vote for who carries that state. What this engineer figured out is, what if a group of states passed a law that said that the electors have to vote for the individual who carries the national vote? But then obviously, and the big states like this in one sense because they're the ones that feel they're being left out of the presidential activities. But to have it possibly happen, it'd be a two-step process that, let's say Massachusetts passes it, but it's with the proviso, it doesn't go into effect until enough states that amount to a majority of the Electoral College have also passed it. And that's a logical circumstance. Now, what I think could also happen, if that happened, let's say, and I think Massachusetts has passed it, by the way. One, maybe two states have passed this. But let's say you're a Massachusetts person. Your state is going Democratic because it's a pretty Democratic state. But let's pretend the national vote went for the Republican candidate. You might say to yourself, oh, I hate that, and instantly call a session of the State House and pass a law knocking out this law. And so whether the states would keep their words is a question mark, is what I'm getting at. But it's this oddity. And by the way, the vice president is chosen by the United States Senate. And that is by each senator gets a vote. In the House, each House member gets a vote, but they get the vote in caucus of their state. And so if you have 5 Republicans and 7 Democrats, presumably the vote will be to go to the Democrat. If you have 2 and 2, which Iowa could well, it might just be a push. Or it could be there'd be someone that would break with their party. But it is really awkward to have this voting by state. And that's something that maybe Gary will be part of. Now, he has a chance, I think the state he has the best chance in it could well be Utah, I guess, where the Mormons really, really don't like Trump. And by the way, that's for 2 reasons. One, Mormons are quite conservative on social issues, but they're also enormously progressive in foreign affairs. There are more Mormons in South America than North America. And many of them have served missions in South America. And so with all these people that have served missions abroad, they are intriguingly progressive internationally at a people-to-people level. And in all other aspects of politics, are very conservative. And that's one of the kind of interesting makeups of the state. Yes, you had a question.
I'm employed at the Engler.
Hey there, my name is Sahan. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Iowa, and I have a question regarding how, free speech on campuses. As a recent graduate, I've been involved on political campaigns and university clubs, political clubs. What I've seen is, there's a big hesitance towards free speech on campuses. There have been, involvements of safe spaces, and students not willing to have a proper dialogue on campuses. And what I see from that is, if students can't have a dialogue on campus and talk about issues that matter the most, how can they have a dialogue when they go to the real world or society? Because society does not have safe spaces or microaggressions or trigger warnings, anything like that. So as someone who served on Capitol Hill, I've seen politics in Washington, D.C., and now as a professor on campuses, what do you think about what's going on campus and on the free speech situation? What would you do to solve the problem, and what's your take on it overall?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, really good speech. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'd say first, I read slightly about it, but barely, just because I've never seen the problem. I remember, as you've articulated, years ago they had an issue in Iowa where in the communications department they had an X-rated movie, and one of the students was offended, and so the administration thought, and they came up with a solution, which was that any time there was an X-rated film, there had to be a published announcement that there was an X-rated film, and if you were offended, don't come. Well, it caused a huge turnout from these X-rated films. I mean, human nature is human nature. And so, but that was, I know there is discussion and that involves lots of campuses about whether or not there's free speech, and then this question, what happens if a student uses racial epithets against another student, and where are you as a society, and shouldn't the university community be a hate-free zone? Shouldn't, my God, the country be a hate-free zone? But that doesn't mean that you can control every word that's said all the time. Now, obviously, we have a presidential candidate that's making non-PC a part of his appeal to more than a few people. My own view is it's really hard to regulate, and it's also the concept of manners or PC. It is more often appropriate than inappropriate, but you hate to make a rule about it. That's why we have a constitution that talks about free speech. And then the question becomes, does it turn over into injuring another person? And it's natural that a university wants to be respectful of everybody. And how you draw the lines in those, I can't tell you. I know I hear luncheon discussions at the law school. People say the university dare not write a rule unless they get a lawyer in the room. And I think there's validity to that. And not just a lawyer, but someone who's really thoughtful on the subject. But there are balancing circumstances one should be careful of. And you certainly want to have a university community be a loving community to the degree you can too. And so that ends up as a goal, possibly having an instinct that isn't totally free in all speech everywhere.
Your old pal Molly here.
Yes,
And
Molly.
I had a couple of questions for you. The first one on gun control. We know that any criminal, legally or illegally, can get their hands on any weapon they want, pretty much. right there? You have some water? And they could get their hands on any weapon. What do you think the solution is logically, other than banning weapons? Because something's always going to be happening, and it seems to be getting worse. And my other question was, I was sitting back here recalling those ready lawn chairs that used to drag from event to event. And I wondered, do those still exist? Will you leave them in your will for me? Or should I write up cut a writ of habeas lawn chairs or something to take those?
Well, they don't still exist, but you raise a really profound question on gun control, and everybody wishes society were a little different than it currently is with all the violence. Of all the minimalist suggestions that one would think would be acceptable to even the most ardent gun controller is to use the analogy to privacy. We have total privacy constitutional protections, but the FBI, with court approval, can wiretap someone. And it strikes me that the Justice Department, on their terrorist list, with the court order, should be able to prohibit these assault rifles from being sold to a very, very small number of people. Now, that doesn't mean that they will be blocked from not getting it somewhere somehow. But it's the minimalist symbolic step that can be made. And I'd be frankly surprised if the NRA couldn't stomach it, but who knows? And one of the traumas of our day is that, and by day I mean circumstance of the country, there are now so many guns out there that it's pretty hard to go backwards. And there are certain things that defy rationality. I mean, the idea that you can carry a gun to school is just preposterous. Everybody wants to protect hunters, but carrying guns to school don't seem to be the answer.
So what do you see as the answer? How do you see this progressing?
Excuse me, I can't hear you.
How do you see this as progressing?
Well,
Is there an end to this, or do you think this?
I don't know. We've had some comments of some in political life on this minimal issue I just mentioned, some favorable and some unfavorable. And so it looks like lines are being drawn. And if one thinks it can be advanced easily, I mean, most Democratic presidential candidates are convinced that Al Gore proved that you couldn't come out for any kind of gun control because he lost his own state over it. And everybody that's a Democrat, therefore, that's presidentially oriented is kind of shy on the issue. This president has made some comments of a different nature. And then you have this issue in American politics that's kind of, I mean, what it clarifies is we've moved into this single issue kind of politics. That someone can be with the majority of the people on an issue, but the majority will not vote for that candidate because of that issue. And there's a powerful minority that will only vote for that candidate because of it. And so you have this majority versus minority in which the minority is stronger than the majority in a democracy. And that is the way it's looked at in political life.
Jim, my impression from hearing your innuendos and chuckles that you're, maybe it's because you just moved to Iowa City 3 years ago, but you seem more Democrat than Republican today. But my question is, after all this big banking spending, risking with CDOs and swaps and all these derivatives, and the crisis we had in 2008, do you regret your bill, the Graham Leach bill?
Well, there is nothing in that bill that touches the subject you just raised.
Well, it gave the government guarantee on a lot of this risky investment. The India.
You know, the banks could do CDOs, derivatives, long before. It's a myth that bill authorized any of that.
Didn't it authorize the use of guaranteed bank investments and
No.
local banks?
No.
The conglomerates, as they built the local banks together. Didn't our guaranteed money in Midwest One, isn't that
I don't know what you mean about Midwest One. I don't know a thing about that. But we've had federal deposit insurance since the 30s. What you can say is, with definitiveness, that the United States government, in its regulatory apparatus, refused to stipulate higher amounts of capital to back deposits and new activities. And that is a function of regulatory judgment, not mandated by any act of Congress, with the exception, and one of the great myths is, because we have, from World War II on, all the powers, with the exception of applying it to a few new actors, that the so-called have existed for federal regulators, if they wanted to use them, that went into the so-called Frank something bill that's considered a great change. But all those powers the regulators had. And it's amazing that people haven't noted that.
Thank you for those informative and thought-provoking comments. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening and remind you that this is a program brought to you by the University of Iowa Alumni Association, and I encourage all of you to investigate other programs and activities that we have in store for you. Notably, on the 30th of June, we'll be down at the University of Iowa Libraries in their new exhibit space to profile and discuss the new exhibit that they have there, discussing Star Trek. So quite a different kind of conversation we're going to have, but nevertheless, very informative and interesting. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Have a good evening, and see you around.